While the rest of the financial world was bracing for a storm they didn't understand, Mr. Griffin was already walking through the rain, perfectly dry. He had won the war of cash flow, not by fighting the tide, but by building a ship that thrived on the waves. The night was cold, but the strategy was fireproof. As he stepped into the waiting car, Mr. Griffin felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew exactly what his money was doing while the world slept. It was moving. It was growing. It was free. The quiet hum of the nighttime city was deceptive. To Mr. Griffin, the silence felt like the breath held before a scream. He sat in the back of his car, the blue light of his smartphone illuminating a face etched with the fatigue of a man who saw too much. He was looking at the M2 money supply charts. The curves were jagged, unnatural, the result of a decade of monetary experiments that had never been performed on this scale. "They think they can manage a soft landing while the wings are on fire," Griffin muttered, scrolling through the latest repo market data. The US banking system was fundamentally a machine for transforming debt into perceived wealth. But that machine required trust as its primary lubricant. Once that trust was compromised by the realization that the underlying collateral, long-term sovereign debt, was losing value due to rising rates, the entire mechanism began to grind. Griffin's strategy for maximizing liquidity was based on a singular, cold realization: when the banking system faces a duration mismatch, it stops being a provider of liquidity and starts being a consumer of it. He began drafting a memo to his offshore partners. The focus, the velocity of capital in a high-interest era. He argued that the traditional concept of savings was a relic of a gold standard mindset that no longer existed. In a fiat world, money was a flow, not a lake. If the flow stopped, the lake turned into a swamp. Griffin's next move involved the repo market. He wasn't just observing it, he was positioned to exploit the spikes. By providing overnight liquidity to desperate mid-tier institutions, he could demand prime collateral at steep discounts. It was a predatory form of safety. He was effectively becoming his own central bank, operating in the shadows where the Fed's reach was filtered through layers of bureaucracy. "Protection against inflation isn't about buying things that go up in price," he dictated into his recorder. "It's about owning the rights to the cash flows that people cannot live without. You don't buy the gold mine, you buy the debt of the mine and ensure your payment is first in line, denominated in whatever currency has the highest velocity at that moment." As the car glided through the deserted streets of the financial district, Griffin's thoughts turned to the history of the dollar. Since 1971, the world had been living in a grand experiment. The decoupling of the dollar from gold had allowed for unprecedented expansion, but it had also created a global debt trap. Now, the walls of that trap were closing in. The US banking system is the heart of the global body, Griffin reflected. But the blood, the liquidity, is clotting. When the Fed raises rates, they are effectively applying a tourniquet. They hope to stop the bleeding of inflation, but they risk causing gangrene in the extremities of the economy. To counter this, Griffin had implemented a multi-jurisdictional flow model. He didn't keep his firm's capital in a single currency or a single legal system. His cash flow was a digital nomad. 1 hour it was in Singaporean REITs, the next it was in Swiss-denominated short-term notes, and by morning it was back in US Treasury ripples. This constant movement served two purposes: it prevented any single tax or regulatory authority from freezing his progress, and it allowed him to capture the arbitrage between different nations' inflationary speeds. He viewed the current macroeconomic climate as a great recalibration. The era of easy money was over, but the era of smart money was just beginning. Most investors were paralyzed by fear because they were looking at the world through the lens of 20th century economics. They looked at GDP, they looked at the unemployment rate, they looked at the Dow Jones. Griffin looked at the plumbing. He looked at the pipes through which the money traveled. He looked at the settlement times, the collateral haircuts, and the swap lines between central banks. He knew that the crash wouldn't start with a stock market dip, it would start with a failed settlement in an obscure corner of the interbank market. If you want to survive the death of a currency, Griffin told his reflection in the car window, you must first learn to live without its banks. You must become the bank. You must be the one who decides who gets to stay liquid and who gets to drown. The car pulled up to his private residence, a fortress of glass and steel. He stepped out into the cold air, feeling the weight of the night. He was one of the few people on the planet who truly understood the scale of the coming shift. For Griffin, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a mathematical necessity. And he was ready for the numbers to balance, no matter how many zeros had to be erased in the process. Mr. Griffin stood in his kitchen, the espresso machine hissing, a mechanical contrast to the eerie silence of the high-rise. He looked at a heat map of San Francisco and Chicago on his tablet. The screens were bleeding red. Commercial real estate, CRE, was no longer an asset class, it was a ticking atmospheric bomb inside the US banking system. The regional banks are holding the bag, Griffin said, his voice echoing against the marble. They lent billions on the assumption that the world would always need glass towers and cubicles. They forgot that a virus could change human geography, and high interest rates could turn a skyscraper into a vertical liability. To maximize his liquidity, Griffin had shorted the CMBS, commercial mortgage-backed securities, indices months ago. But he wasn't just betting on a crash, he was waiting for the liquidation event. When these regional banks hit a capital wall, they wouldn't just stop lending, they would start selling everything at 50 cents on the dollar. That was when Griffin's cash, protected, mobile, and untainted by the banking system's leverage, would become the most powerful weapon in the room. Americans think their money is safe because of the FDIC, Griffin noted, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. But the FDIC only has a fraction of the reserves needed for a systemic failure. The real insurance isn't a government seal, it's the ability to exit the burning building before the doors are bolted shut. By 8 a.m., Griffin was back in the war room. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, minutes were due to be released. The market was desperate for a pivot, a sign that the Fed would stop the pain and start the printing presses again. But Griffin knew the Fed was trapped in a Volcker moment with a Weimar shadow. If they cut rates to save the banks, inflation goes to double digits, he explained to his junior partner, a bright-eyed Wharton grad who still believed in textbooks. If they keep rates high to kill inflation, the entire regional banking system implodes. They aren't looking for a solution anymore, they are looking for someone to blame. Griffin's macro strategy involved the shadow pivot. While the public waited for the official interest rate decision, Griffin was watching the hidden liquidity facilities. He saw how the Fed was quietly funneling billions through backdoor swap lines to keep the plumbing from freezing. This was stealth inflation. The money supply was expanding in the shadows while the headlines screamed about tightening. You have to watch what they do, not what they say, Griffin remarked, pointing to the spike in the Fed's balance sheet. They are trying to inflate the debt away without letting the public realize their savings are being taxed through devaluation. It's the greatest heist in human history, and it's being run by men in Brooks Brothers suits. He authorized a massive move into hard cash flow assets, energy infrastructure and private credit. These were the only sectors that could dictate their own prices in an inflationary spiral. By owning the toll booths of the economy, Griffin ensured that his liquidity wasn't just preserved, it was being fed by the very inflation that was starving everyone else. The most dangerous part of a macro cycle isn't the math, Griffin mused during a mid-morning briefing. It's the loss of faith. When the average American realizes that their 401k is down 30% in real terms, and their grocery bill is up 50%, the social contract begins to fray. He saw the signs everywhere, the rise of alternative currencies, the flight to hard assets, and the growing resentment toward the coastal financial elite. Griffin didn't care about the optics, he cared about the outcome. He began moving his firm's operational base to a sovereign-like structure, reducing exposure to the U.S. domestic legal system's potential emergency measures, such as wealth taxes or capital controls. In a crisis, the government will do whatever it takes to survive, Griffin warned. They will seize, they will tax, and they will freeze. Your only defense is to be too fast to catch and too complex to understand. Liquidity isn't just about cash, it's about freedom of movement. He watched the ticker for a mid-sized bank in Ohio. It was down 12% in 20 minutes. The contagion was spreading. Griffin picked up the phone. It was time to start bidding on the distressed assets. Not the buildings, the debt. He wanted the keys to the kingdom, but he wanted them at a price that guaranteed he would own the future. By noon, the high-frequency trading algorithms were screaming. Mr. Griffin sat in his glass-walled sanctuary, watching the 10-year Treasury yield curve dance like a dying nerve. For decades, the US Treasury was considered the risk-free rate, the bedrock of global finance. But Griffin knew that when inflation sits at 8% and the bond yields 5%, the risk-free part is a lie. It is a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. The greatest trick the Fed ever pulled was convincing the world that government debt is safety, Griffin remarked to his chief strategist. Safety isn't a piece of paper backed by a government that is $34 trillion in the hole. Safety is a productive asset that can raise its prices faster than the central bank can print its currency. To maximize liquidity in this environment, Griffin had pivoted into alpha flow assets. He was no longer lending to the government, he was lending to the critical infrastructure that the government couldn't afford to let fail. Power grids, water treatment facilities, and specialized logistics hubs. These were the new treasuries in Griffin's world. They provided a cash flow that was indexed to inflation, creating a natural shield that moved in lockstep with the debasement of the dollar. The US banking system is built on the illusion of par value, Griffin continued, circling a plummeting bank stock on his monitor. They assume $1 today is $1 tomorrow. But in a macro storm, the only thing that stays at par is the debt you owe. The value of what you own is what the market is willing to pay in a panic. And right now, the market is starting to smell the smoke. As the sun crossed the meridian, Griffin turned his attention to the plumbing of the financial world, the repo market. This was where the big banks traded collateral for overnight cash. It was the silent heartbeat of the global economy. When the repo rate spiked, it meant the banks didn't trust each other. It meant the blood was stopping in the veins. Look at the haircuts, Griffin pointed out. The banks are demanding more collateral for the same amount of cash. They are tightening the noose on themselves. Every time the Fed drains reserves, they create a vacuum.